most, if not all of you, will have been confronted with the doom and gloom narrative of the massive decline of honeybee populations in the global north. We often get to hear that humanity will be gone from Earth a few years after the honeybees' extinction, as our shared ecosystem would collapse without their pollination work.
If you spend time with bees and beekeepers from Europe, North America or Russia, you get a strong sense of the environmental crisis we're in. Monoculture landscapes and pesticides leave little space for bees. Global efficiency breeding and highly invasive beekeeping practices bring more and more globalized honeybee diseases. In fact, one could get the impressions that the emphasis in the name of this animal is clearly on the first part, the honey. All in all, this forms a complex, not easy to build solutions on.
In our work, we decided to stay with this trouble and to dive into some rather unusual forms of multi-species entanglements. We found ourselves in various apiaries in Germany, Switzerland, and in Wales. We followed our actors and actants into laboratories and science institutions and into forests in Saxonia, Germany, and in Bashkortostan in the southern Ural. Instead of focusing on beekeepers in an economic or traditionalist way, we spend a lot of time closely with bees, humans, and a parasitic mite, which appeared in Central Europe in the late 70s, coming from South Asia via Siberia.
The mite was named Varroa destructor and should live up to that name since it caused a massive decline of the local honeybee populations of the western honeybee Apis mellifera. A complex process including a whole cloud of viruses, fungi, and the bee's immune system. In Central Europe, the bees research institutes, beekeepers associations, and the pharmaceutical industry started a medication program to extinguish the mite. 40 years later, still all beekeepers, nearly in Germany, are obliged to treat their bees, while frequency and amount of the used drugs were raised constantly. The viral mite developed strategies to deal with the medication and spread to nearly all places on Earth where Apis mellifera dwelt. In some places, as in Wales, Siberia, or in Eastern Africa, people didn't treat the bees against Varroa, and the bees developed their own strategies to deal with the mite and the viruses.
Working on a beehive, sometimes it's hard to tell on what scale you are facing your counterpart. Sometimes you're warned or stung by one or a few individual bees, but most of the beekeepers feel a certain relationship to each individual colony. If they keep only a couple of hives, as most of the beekeepers do, they will soon be able to know each colony by behavior. As a superorganism, bees develop a decisive and predictable character. If they are too aggressive, too unproductive, or too creative architects, some beekeepers replace their queen with one from a better colony, hoping for a certain chance of transferring their behavior. Breeders discovered that some bees had the knowledge to disturb the mite's reproduction, to detect infested brood and take it out. Some bees were even attacking the mites. Of course, this behavior didn't have a chance to spread genetically, as the medication helped all bees to survive and breeding followed a different agenda. But news from the US, from Russia, and from Wales about surviving bees entered the discourse. In remote areas, bees and mites had developed a stable relationship. In Wales and in the Primorsky region, in the Ural, and also in Eastern Africa, beekeepers didn't believe in treating, and it took only a few years until the domestic and the feral bees formed a stable population. Therefore, genetic material, as breeders or especially commercial breeders used to call their bees, genetic material was brought from Russia to the US from Kenya to Sweden, and these days both are crosses into the famous Backfass lines in Bavaria. The Queen VT14, for example, was crossbred by one of our interlocutors and protagonists. You will meet him amongst others downstairs in one of the videos. As an attempt to breed resistant bees that could survive without medication.
Inspired by these examples are attempts that went for a different approach than breeding, and that tries to operate on a different scale. Here, ecologists and foresters have started to claim an interest in having the honeybee back in their forests. The call for natural selection instead of breeding also meant a shift in the idea what natural means. Thus, the mite became nature, kept from its selective capabilities by human unnatural interference. The search for a naturally harmonious relationship between the three became a new goal. Inspired by the possibility of feral bees in our forests, a movement started to revive the medieval tradition of tree beekeeping, where beekeepers harvest honey from less productive bees, but feral bees, up to 6 meters high in living trees. Since only little of this knowledge survived, European beekeepers and foresters have started to connect with Bashkirian tree beekeepers to revive this tradition in Europe. With breeding on the one hand and tree beekeeping on the other, we have just addressed the material of the 2 video pieces you will find downstairs. Both are part of a longer documentary film project that is still in progress, and in both, honeybees, mites, humans, and technologies are engaged in various material worlds. Learning how to build a natural tree hole for honeybees, or how to keep them once they moved in. Knowing what to look for when you look through a microscope. Searching for varroa mites and for a specific genetic material. Those are some of the practices we were interested in during our research and filming process.
The use of film and ethnographic methods in the field of political ecology and human-animal studies, backed by what has been called an ontological turn as well as by behavioral sciences, is rather new and for some a controversial issue. Our point of departure for this research and film project is a shared interest in sensory knowledge, in material worlds, in different forms of representation and evocation, as well as in other than human ethnography. Films usually use a toolbox of storytelling to catch the viewer's interest, and they work with the viewer's willingness to identify with the heroes of the story. Working in a field where different actors with different modes of existence use different forms to express themselves, we wonder which means can be found to navigate through and with this willingness. There is a German noun that roots the process of filmmaking unmistakably into the observational paradigm of the 19th and 20th century documentary discourse. A lens, in German, is called Objektiv. It is understood as an optical system that conveys a real picture of an object. But it is not the question of scientific objectivism in non-fiction filmmaking that we want to address over again today. It is the Objektiv, the lens itself, that concerns us. Together with some more technical devices, altering sound and image in ways that might be allowing us to immerse ourselves into a more relational network of human and non-human actors and actors of very different sizes.
Scholars like Laura Marx and David McDougall, both drawing on the Austrian art historian Alois Riegel, have pointed out the capability of close-range vision and close-range sound recording to evoke tactile and multisensory impressions of textures. Now, is there an eye level with an insect? Or is there a sort of empathy if the other has such a different mode of existence? Are macro images and strongly directed microphones a way to connect to other than human others? Is slow motion supporting a corporeal and sensory resonance with animals reacting and moving much faster than our eyes are capable of observing? What do we see when we shift our attention from an oculocentric and humanocentric one to a mode of perception that distributes attention with more symmetry between the actors and in this string figure, including the camera and sound devices? What do we see when we hear unfamiliar sounds, when we see unfamiliar objects?
Yeah, those are some of the questions we are working with while we are immersing ourselves in this field, and also some of the questions we would like to discuss with you after you've experienced our video installation down in the other room downstairs. And we would also like to encourage you to regard the objects or the things we put on the table not as objects, but rather as a material, and to engage with these materials. And you will find them also in the videos, and maybe it could be interesting for you to deal with them in a other than only visual oculocentric way. So enjoy.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
As you may have seen yesterday, and as the spotlight indicates, the central character of my intervention is a stone. And as you also see, I joined my stone for now in being sedentary and in being part of these threads and tangled mess. I hope you will forgive me for breaking conventions, not standing up, and knotting myself up a bit for now. So far in the context of MatCon, we have encountered things that were deliberately made to move, things that travel and thereby connect. And we thought through the stubbornness of things, the resistance of materials against being reinterpreted indefinitely, and their capacity to carry on ideas, connections, power relations, etc., inscribed in the durable flesh. Well, I picked a protagonist that is very stubborn and very durable. It is one that does not move, or does it? I will be coming to that in a minute. It is an immobile, so immobile that what you see today can only be a smaller, this remake. And this was quite resistance against being brought here, I can tell you still. My sore muscles tell you too. My proper protagonist is called Tamdatash, which means letter stone in Kyrgyz. It is immobile, and it is located close to the village Tamra in northern Kyrgyzstan, in a landscape that is not too dissimilar from the one painted on this wall. It is about 4 meters wide and 2 meters high, and it is one out of 3 stones in the area inscribed with Tibetan letters. Apparently the letters stem from roughly the 7th century, but the archaeological historical knowledge on them is hard to be had, so that's why I can only say roughly. The village Tamra is small and not exactly a touristic hotspot, but it has the lettered stone as local attraction. So by now there are some posts on travel blogs and entries in guidebooks, and villagers organizing walks up into the mountains foothills to the Tamdatash. The stone is an important node for the village. It gave it its name, Tamra, and it keeps pulling in people with its inscriptions. It is a minor source of income for elderly ladies and some school children, and something one can talk about with newcomers. So that is the story. That's the story I want to tell. It is a small story, but yet within the small story, I can find, trace and twist out some more abstract and far-reaching ones. Stories, or rather question perhaps, on connectivities and materialities. Hoping to re-evoke the spirit and method of the MatCon workshops that took place so far, I constructed an intervention as open-ended invitation to have a close look at small things put on the table or put on the ground, and to learn to see and ask in new ways, because for me, learning to see and learning to ask, that is actually at the core of ethnographic and theoretical thought and practice. For now, I want to give you 5 followed-up examples, 5 MatCon questions I find worthwhile disentangling and that I see emerging from the Tamratash. So let me start. 1. How can the immobility of stubborn matters entice others to move? How can locatedness, not mobility, contribute to connections? How much immobility and fixity is needed, perhaps, to become an attraction? We often talk and think about the potentiality of mobility when talking about connections, be it the speeding up of lives, trade flows, knowledge production, economic crisis, etc., by information, communication and transportation technologies. Or be it ideas like the one of immutable mobiles by Bruno Latour, standardized sign systems as ways of knowledge stabilization that remain the same when detached from the object of description and when shifting contexts. These are just examples. But then is not immobility, fixity too, an important aspect of many phenomena? Movement towards places and things, and fixity that singles out. We could talk about many sites that are considered attractions, but in my case it is a rock that has to be visited in order to be seen and touched, because it just can't be moved. A rock that pulls in people to the close-by village, a rock that becomes a small knot on travel itineraries and for Tamra's guest housekeepers. 2. How are these attracting immobiles paired up with more mobile narratives, with stories, to become the movers they are? Could one say that narratives make immobiles travel partially? What I just stated in point 1 should in no way be read as impairment of movability. It should rather be seen as a hint that mobility might be only one side of the coin, and that it may be productive to have a closer look at the creative intersections of mobiles and immobiles, mobility and immobility. The Tamratash stubbornness becomes attractional only when joined with, indeed, traveling stories, histories considered valuable, and photographs. Which leads me to question 3. 3. How can one grasp the gradual and variable plurality of a thing's mobility? The palpable stone is not mobile, but its partly detached images, its writing, and its stories are, especially when put online. So the Tamratash stands still, while its image and some accompanying information circulate via notes and guidebooks or blogs, each medium with its own speed, longevity, and purview. As the various parts of the installation give away, I'm interested in mediality and the qualities of media, printed text, told stories, sported photographs. All are linked, potentially pulling towards and somehow bound to the fixed letter stone in Kyrgyzstan, but they are also gradually detachable in their own specific materiality. And in that, they open up other scales and ways of spatial presence, of connections. Interestingly enough, in this example, the Tamratash, the letter stone, itself is again a medium for alphabetic characters, a symbol system that, in its specificity, makes it easy to re-recognize and recreate Tamra's Tamratash as a singularity, and one that allows me to evoke it in a painted, smaller equivalent. Quite long-lived, as medium, stones are special, I think. So on to question 4. 4. What happens if one concentrates on time instead of space when talking about mobility and connectivity? In space, the more volatile and gradually less material aspects, like language, seem to travel and be transported more easily. But when it comes to movement and connection through time, then stubborn durability, like that of stones, might come first in the long run. Stones, hard and durable, are yet mutable. I read in Mark Aldendorfer's abstract on stone and spirit. The Tamratash is not the same as it was when it was inscribed. Its purpose has changed, its relations have changed, lichen has grown over it, and it weathers. Yet in comparison to other materials and to the lives of organisms, it is very durable and preserving. Even though I, and neither anybody living in the village, cannot read or write Tibetan words, they are decipherable and keep bearing witness to a distant past and temporally distant political constellations. Stones can be time connectors in a material setup, and when something is fixed into the setup, it can travel along. Paper and spoken words would long have dissolved and would not have remained so self-similar in shape. Last but not least, the fifth question, still fascinated by mediality and coming back to the pairing of mobility and immobility. 5. Are not many of the stories on material connectivities and connecting materialities stories on fixations and detachments and their creative, partial and gradual to and fro? Connections, ideas, concepts, technologies of all kinds, etc., always already somehow material themselves, are implicitly or explicitly inscribed into the life world and its matters, where again they can be physically experienced, read perhaps, picked up and be detached and developed further, and ever so on. This happens all the time and in very different ways according to the materials affordances, symbol systems, communication and planning practices, you name it. The Tamratash is potentially attractive because it was made visibly special by being inscribed. Stories on a letter stone get spread. The stories are picked up and fixed in a guidebook's writing, which might again be picked up by somebody planning a trip, and so on. What seems interesting to me is that these aspects concur, or I might even say correspond perhaps. The Tamratash is what it is because it is mobile and narratively mobile at the same time. Its durable materiality and its stories can be distinguished, but they can never be separated fully. Both at the same time make up the connections the letter stone has, or rather is. I would like to stop here for now. The points I made are speculative, I know, and they do not add up very smoothly. They are clustered loosely and they are not ends in themselves, and it is not by coincidence that I have loose ends lying around here. They are openings, and as interventions, they have to be followed up, and I hope I could at least whet your appetite a little bit to do just that and to explore the Tamrata's connecting fibers during the next 2 days. I decided to take up the theoretical and conceptual stance in my intervention and my accompanying talk because this is what I drew from MatCon. Words, patterns and ideas to think with from the small, to be developed further and to become productive in different places and on different scales. The questions I posed were grand, and as all grand questions, they are easily on the verge of turning out to be banal. It is up to you to decide on that matter. For now, I invite you to either join the speculative musing or to inquire deeper about the installation and my stubborn stone. Thank you.
So how this works, or how we imagine this to work, is that that you take time and spend some time with these installations here, and that part of this sort of enters the workshop upstairs over the course of the days. Be it like thematically, remains of the Tibetan Empire, be it like methodologically with the loose ends and so on. Lisa's work can also be followed. She's been writing an experimental blog between like anthropology and literature under the title Following Fibers. So if you want to follow up a few of these loose ends, Google Following Fibers and you'll find Lisa's.
The webpage is also open on the computer, and the 2 stories printed out are the 2 latest stories on the blog, which are related to the stone. So
before I know we're all like now very much in need of coffee. Let us just give three little comments or interventions room here to give some feedback to Lisa. Yes.
So I was absolutely fascinated by your talk, and it reminded me of another stone or accumulator, which is the Berlin Wall. A wall which was there and people it connected and separated at the same time, but at the same time then it suddenly became mobile. It was cut into small pieces and traveled all around the world. It became atomized and everyone had a traveling piece. I have at my home the same thing. And then people were trying to bring it back there because there was someone missing the wall. There was the wall, it was the big attraction, and there wasn't the wall anymore. And then he tried to preserve and make basically cultural heritage and show it in the ground because it was important that there was still something wally like where it was formerly there. So I just want to enforce, and it just as an example how important it is to have this idea that something which is stable and static can connect and at the same time become mobile and then be reassembled, to something. But I think this is a very, very productive way of dealing with also architecture and monuments that seem so static at the first glance. So I liked your intervention very, very much.
Thank you.
Mark?
Well, we share a lot in terms of our ideas about stones. We'll hear more about my stones this afternoon, but I just wanted to say that the adding of the diachronic perspective is really critical here, because my stones go back even further than yours, I think, at least in theory. They do. But we'll find out about the reality of that as I have the presentation. But I appreciate the fact that you've been able to make these connections in a variety of really creative ways that are not only useful for us, but also for the local people, actually the folks who actually live on the ground with these stones, because that's part of my story as well, as I'll be telling it today. Thank you.
Looking forward to that.
More time.
Then it's really time to...
Okay, well, welcome back to the next to the next session, which still belongs as a sort of concluding and opening statement intervention to the rethinking materialities. And I think I just had another chat with Jillian. How do we allow the smoke to show us what the smoke does, without paying too much attention into which category we squeeze it in? French post-structuralism, or whatever frameworks we do, and that's a methodological question. I tried to make that point yesterday, and I do think that in order to get closer to the smoke, or whatever material connectivity and connecting materiality we try to understand, there is the methodological problem where we can and should draw, for example, from the arts or other forms of knowledge production in order to study, investigate, and also represent. I think that presentations and books really won't do the trick for us to understand smoke. And in that sense, I want to introduce the next intervention, Natalie, who allows us to return to the what's the Spanish name again?
what?
Orishas,
Orishas, yeah.
whom we referred to yesterday also when we tried to show you how the research process of the first workshops actually worked. And again, that whole idea that we tried to understand things in a 2 or 3 dimensional way, and now we try to use them also to make an argument which hopefully allows us to move beyond the squeezing of things into certain categories. So without further ado, Natalie.
Yeah, thank you, Philip, very much. Well, my task here was to visualize the argument, to make an academic artistic intervention. So you are very welcome to have a closer look to this installation of different materials, dolls and images. And these Barbie dolls already have been my contribution to the first MatCon workshop because of the highly interesting connotation they have adopted in Afro-Cuban sacred installations in Havana and Santiago. And here now I have tried to integrate them into a broader context. But before I start my talk, I would like just you to tell me what your eyes see. Just tell it. Don't think too much.
The red-haired Barbie doesn't look like the other Barbies.
Sorry, again?
Her face is different. The red-haired Barbie doesn't look like
all right.
Certainly the 2 on the left.
Okay, so one Barbie is a special Barbie for you. Yeah, some other comments? Just tell me what you see. Yeah.
Elements and Mother Earth, Gaia.
Elements? What kind of?
Oh, like you've got charcoal, coal, metal,
okay.
water, and I'm not sure.
Honey. Okay. Thank you. Another comment? Maybe one more.
Cared for, the arrangement. Going back to the curated this morning.
Okay.
It's a cared for arrangement.
All right.
Of elements.
Okay.
Dancing perhaps.
Dancing, so movement, but stopped.
Both would remind me of culinary practices with something inside.
Okay, so like food bowls, okay. So what you don't see now, that here is a kind of installation of different images that are connected to this material representations here, but maybe you can look afterwards. Okay, I will start with a broader context. Well, in the course of the big transfer that started at the beginning of the 16th century and terminated at the end of the 19th century, people from different regions in West Africa had been transported to Cuba together with a variety of West African religious imaginaries and sacred entities that had traveled in their heads. In their homelands, these sacred beings had been visualized through carved sculptures and wooden masks that everybody knows as the famous African art. That decorated and now still decorate the altars or the voodoo altars of Nigeria and Benin. It is really remarkable, and for me it was really remarkable, that not only none of these objects survived this transfer into the New World, but also that the transfer itself led to a kind of radical fracture in their understanding of images, objects and materialities and their representational agency in general. This fracture has been in the focus of my studies on art and religious representations in Cuba during many years and still continues to deeply fascinate me. And one of the reasons of my fascination about that is that a very similar kind of rupture happened within the history of contemporary art. For instance, if you think about the famous oeuvre of Marcel Duchamp and his famous urinal, I don't know how you call it, pronounce it in English, and I would call it the turnaround from art objects to conceptual art. Or as the American art philosopher Arthur Danto called it, the turnaround from the appearance of an object to what he calls its aboutness. In the course of this process, the eye, which before, or which maybe also now here, could be regarded as a medium of choice in the distinction between objects, and especially between objects of art and trash, or of objects and art and other objects, any kind of objects here in this room, trivial objects. In both examples, in Santeria and also in contemporary conceptual art, lost its supremacy. So with your eyes, you won't understand anything here. You can't use your eye. So in order to identify this installation as related, in any kind of relation to the Afro-Cuban religions, you have to know something about it or get some information. Otherwise, I think you will just see dolls. Yeah, dolls in a kind of really strange combination and installation. So even so, the history of the Afro-Cuban religions and their objects in the first place is a story of disruptions and fractions. I found it during this MatCon workshops also very sensible to try to recount it as a story of connectivities. Because new traces and new threads have been weaved and knit around these objects and dolls and saints that connect continents, ideas, beliefs, and also family ties. But maybe let me first give a brief insight into the situation of fractions before I will follow the pathways of connectivities made through objects and their materialities. The divergence between the appearance of an object and its significance, this fracture characterizes the sacred art of the Afro-Cuban religions from the beginning of the colonial time until today and provokes to interpret it within a conceptual framework. This fracture can be attributed to the conditions of slavery as a shared experience which all the deported people from Western Africa to the New World have in common. This is the awareness that there is only one place in which religious ties, the gods, and the conception of religion can be kept alive. And this is an inner space of consciousness and imaginary. Both of these inner spaces served as a reservoir of religious concepts, images, and ideas during the first decades of arrival in the New World. So there are some anthropologists who focus on that, like Stefan Palmier or Sidney Mintz and Richard Price, who describe this experience as an ongoing process of destabilization in which the mismatch between cultural and religious knowledge and the total loss of all cultural systems and institutions in which these atomized fragments could have been reassembled like a puzzle again into a new pattern of significance. Within 500 years of transatlantic slave trade, traditions of skilled manual work, such like carving or painting, or really the handicraft, has never again been readopted in Cuba. So nobody ever had the idea of doing a figure again made of wood. One reason was certainly the prohibition of any kind of African religious expression, and thus the need of camouflage tactics as one point now. And that led the Afro-American syncretism to the fusion of Catholic iconography with religious contents from West Africa. So in the first centuries of the Spanish colonial rule in Cuba, the sacred beings of the Yoruba pantheon, the Orishas, were addressed in the figures of Catholic saints. Another reason was explained by David Brown, who argues that the process of creolization is accompanied by the adoption of highly valued status symbol of the dominant culture. During this time, it was the colorful images of Catholic saints like porcelain Madonna statues or the saints. So now then we have come to an understanding of a situation where an image like the statue of Santa Barbara, like this Barbie doll is a substitute of Santa Barbara, is invocated as Shango, and Shango is the Yoruba god of virility, masculinity, fire, and royal power. Meanwhile, the adepts of Santeria state that these two personalities have absolutely nothing in common except their red color. So, the rupture, for my opinion, consists in a kind of systematic doubt in images, materialities, and figures of the visible world. They no longer mean what they seem to be. Images and material objects can lie. They can hide meanings as well as trigger them. Material objects can easily be replaced by others as long as they fulfill their task to evoke or trigger concepts. In this case, the concept of the Orishas. So these Barbie dolls are in a way completely unimportant. It's like they evoke an image of another entity. In this installation, so you don't see any of those Catholic saints. Instead, you see Barbie dolls sitting in front of different materialities or substances, like honey, water, charcoal, and iron tools. And even so, they seem to be like normal Barbie dolls. Their faces and clothes, their habitus, let's say, has a strong visual impact, or at least for me it has. I really love them. They have their own materiality that unfolds its impression, like for me they are wild, they're used, they're trashy, shabby, and also like morbid. Maybe if you go to a shop you could get other Barbies. Sacred objects that decorate the altars of Santeria adepts in Cuba today have been adopted to the actual situation, to contemporary ideas of beauty and of desires. They are ready-mades acquired in US American stores, sent by relatives from Miami and New York. Sacred objects in Cuba are souvenirs from all over the world, as well as toys, trash, gathered in waste dumps, in playrooms or in shops. So we have to have in common that there is no Barbie doll production in Cuba. Every Barbie doll comes from the States, whatever that really means in this situation. The process of manual creation in this case has been replaced by selection and assignment. So what we were talking about before is like you could just take anything, and say, this is my Orisha. It's not so important who it is, It could be a Barbie doll, it could also be another entity. So selection and assignment is the artistic process in this moment. It's not the act of fabrication. But however, a material connection to the deity has to be established first. So these Barbies had undergone a ritual washing with decoctions of herbs that have been associated with the Orishas. And only these decoctions enabled them to represent the Orishas of the Yoruba pantheon. And also a bundle of herbs and other substances associated with the Orisha has been placed inside their bodies. And it can also be taken away when you don't want them to be on the altars anymore. So with this action of putting material inside the doll, the appearance of the doll is not changed. The appearance is the same, but what really has changed completely is the idea of the object. Yeah. So in words of Danto, its aboutness has changed. So and this makes of the same figure a completely different material object. So putting the focus again on friction and on connection, we can see that the Orishas came to the New World stripped of any kind of materialities. The new bodies they inhabited in the New World were lent by another religion. At first, a fact that connected suddenly Catholic saints and places like churches or actions like processions to African gods. In a first step, the saints but were substituted by dolls. However, a Barbie doll is a particular case for me. It's not any kind of doll. A Barbie doll, first because they're the vivid signs of family ties that continued over decades connecting Cuba and the USA, which had been politically separated since the Cuban Revolution. And second, while the Barbie dolls are literally saturated with the sacred materialities of the Orisha, with these herbs, at the same time they are encrusted with the fine texture of Cuban dreams, of consumption and the feverish delirium of departure. So like the saints, Barbies are objects that are highly charged with their own narrative. It's the story of Ken and Barbie in the American glamour world. Barbies are really powerful objects, and the connection of Orisha and Barbie heightens their power. And that again is what the Orisha is about. It is about to provide their adepts with power that enables them to achieve their goals, like travel to the US, get this glamour world, and also realize their dreams, whatever they are. So the substance, yes, but the substances which accompany the dolls that you can see here, in contrast, establish a completely different layer. Then these are the material correspondence of the orishas that have been characterizing them ever since. So Shango, this, stop. The Shango is the orisha of associated with fire. Ochung is the orisha of love and beauty, and honey is the substance most associated with this female orisha. Then you have Yemaya for the sea, and some iron material for Ogun, which is the orisha of blacksmiths and iron. These substances link the conceptual part of the orishas to the materialities, which he is supposed to inhabit, and which are now connected to these Barbie dolls. But again, these substances is not the orisha. It is just pointing to an energy that it's like the essence of the sea, or the essence of beauty, or the essence of iron. It's not the iron itself. So again, you have different layers of material object that just point to a concept. And what is the orisha in reality? Nobody can tell you, because it is not a figure, it's just a concept, I would say. Yes, another habitat of the orishas are the specific environments that are understood as areas of their activities and work. These were the pictures that it just stopped now. So they're areas of where they work, or donde trabajan. This is beauty salons, for instance, or fashion shows, or freshwater spas for the deity of love. Then sea and beaches for Yemaya. And bodybuilding studios for Shango, because every Cuban macho, he wants to have Shango and have good muscles. And then junkyards or surgeries for Ogun, which is the orisha of iron, who can cut and separate. So the lines of connectivities which can be found in this installation seem to have some similarity with what André Breton called the surrealist dislocation. Beautiful as the chance meeting on a dissection table of a sewing machine and an umbrella. Or as Max Ernst defined it, a linking of two realities that by all appearance have nothing to link them in a setting that by appearance does not fit them. The figure of the Barbie doll is the venue where orishas, which had traveled all the way from Africa to Cuba, meet with the story of Ken and Barbie, a narrative of consumption and styling, where trash meets religion and Americans meet Cubans. Areas of daily life become places where the religious power of the orishas can be embodied or perceived corporeal, like in beauty salons or in the force of the cutting scalpel of the surgeon, and where fine lines of imaginaries and relations tie these places again back to the Barbies. But after all, these Barbies are exchangeable. You can throw them to the garbage, you can give them to your children. So this is a circle of exchange that is always possible. And part, if you think about connectivities, part of this lines of connectivities is also the text that I had been reading now to you, because I think that this text connects the installation and its material components to the aboutness of the objects, or the idea of the objects, which I would say could not be captured with the eyes. Thank you very much.
Any questions, comments?
Yeah. I'm very inspired by your talk, especially also the idea of that the materiality doesn't change, but the perception of the object changes completely, which is my first change.
Exactly, because I was really,
very, very much.
Yes.
Because this shows where the category works very, very well, because it stays the same, but our perception completely changes. What would interest me is, Patrick Geary and others have shown that in the medieval times there's these kind of punishment practices to statues of holy men and women. You know, you can piss on them if you don't get the plague rid of the city. Or
not only in medieval times, there are some saints that you can really
you really can
be bad with them.
By hurting this. I would be interested if, let's say, I have this Orisha and I have the feeling it doesn't help me, can I punish an Orisha by, let's say, cutting the hair of the Barbie or holding it a little bit in the fire or something like this? Can I do something like this?
Well, there are different categories of sacred entities. You can't punish an Orisha, but there are the deads, los muertos, the dead souls, and they really need punishment. Or the more you punish them, the more strong they get. And yes, because you need to wake them up. There's supposed to be in a kind of line above our living space. So if you really talk badly to them, they wake up and help you. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I was wondering, this has, to me, it sparks like a connection basically between things, objects, and images.
Yes.
Especially. I wonder how much can you relate between these objects and basic functioning of images. I was saying earlier that the idea that if I affect this materiality, it corresponds some way to another presence, or it refers to something beyond this very materiality that is present here. How can we link these two? I'm very interested. Wondering how can we link the poetics and the lives of images to the lives of objects and of things themselves.
Yes.
Where is the bridge there?
Well, I would say that catalysator, how you call it in English? Catalyst. I would say they work like catalysts, like in conceptual art. I mean, this Barbie, because of they're put there because of the color they have. So this color is white and blue, is associated with the sea. So if you look at them, they evoke in your head, like a catalyst, the image of this deity. Yeah. So it's like it could be, maybe you could compare it like a text. I mean, you read it and then you think about it. So the real image is in your head, not outside. Because they know that it has nothing to do with the Orishas. They would say it, no? They would tell you. But you can look at them and then you think about it. So it triggers your imagination. So the real object is in your imaginary, I would say.
Adam.
That kind of connects onto my question, and it was it's so fascinating because you opened with us seeing things in this and then giving us the aboutness of these objects. And I was minded of, I guess, at the beginning of Jillian's talk, when she mentioned she would have liked to bring smoke into the room to give us that. And I'm just wondering, how far do stories bring us? They might bring us to the aboutness of things, but I'm not sure I'm able to see the Orisha because I don't have a number of other kind of contexts or situations.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering about the kind of methodological limits or possibilities of the story or the bringing into aboutness, or whether these are or are not actual objects from Cuba, or if that even matters, and the space in between the kind of objects, the stories, and the kind of practices in the localities. So kind of what we're doing in this room, and then also what your research you were doing in Cuba, how these things connect.
So these Barbies, they are Cuban Barbies, and they came from altars, and they had been desacralized.
Okay.
Yeah, so they had undergone a process of desacralization. But it is complete for me. I tell you this because it's the truth, but I could just also go tomorrow to a flea market, get some Barbies, put them there. I would say it doesn't make any difference. Yeah. My research was on the combination of the Afro-Cuban sacred arts that I've focused on the modern, on the trashy representations of sacredness in Cuba, and how contemporary artists relate again to this kind of aesthetics. This was my research about. Yes.
Wow. So I'm really interested in the difference between the materiality that's in front there on view, that, as you say, is kind of symbolically attenuated. It's what it shows, what it represents,
yes,
in a way, and what the herbs are doing in the sacralization of this, which is hidden.
which is
and
hidden.
which is and what it is, what it's doing there, what the herbs, that relationship.
Yes.
Is essential.
Okay.
That seems like slightly different.
Yes, I mean there are so many different layers of imaginaries, objects, and materialities that I can't explain everything now. Because there, I would say there are 4 layers more that even include stones. Because but yeah, there's a concept in Cuba that is called Ache. Ache means the special energy and the life energy of every living substance. And a person who is very enigmatic, a very strong person, has a lot of Ache, but a personal Ache. And every Orisha has its own power, its own Ache. So to these Ache are related animals that you sacrifice, then substances and plants and animals and colors. So the whole world could be explained in terms of the Ache of one specific Orisha. That's why I put these images here, because you could say, one Santero, he said to me, if you really want to learn about the Orishas, let's just see a telenovela, because the telenovelas are full of Orishas. You find, you know, the female with the mirror, and you know, so this is Ochung. This is the energy of Ochung. You could find it everywhere. So the plants that you choose for these decoctions, they have the Ache of this specific Orisha. And if you bath the dolls and every object that you bring in connection to these herbs, then you can just put the Ache into this artificial body of the Orisha, and then you can also take it out.
We have to wind down. I think for me personally, the installation worked very well in between the two overarching themes. It helped us to rethink materialities, but it also alluded to the longue durée. And I think to me the key point was that you said that material objects can be replaced as long as they evoke concepts. But the other side of the coin is that concepts ask to be materialized and rematerialized. So the narrative and the memory itself doesn't seem to do the trick, but you have to re-embed it into concrete realities, different orishas, different material things along the way. And that might be at the heart how we can explain something like, you know, cultural longevity. What I seems, as Tim pointed out yesterday, seems to be a continuity. And we talk a lot about change and difference, but there seems to be still something like Italian or German is around. At least these categories are used. So how can we explain that they survive when the material changes? And it links back to my own work in Samoa, where cultural practices, the materials were prohibited. And what did people change? New material, the concept survived. So quite interesting, I think the dialectic between concept and material expression, I think, can show us how we can actually grasp something like a long durée of whatever it is. And that links perfectly, I think, to our next session on temporal materialities, where we try to understand the material dimension of time itself. So without further ado, another round of applause for Natalie.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We just talked about materiality and the distance to the body and the effects that this has. I have to apologize, I'm not as well as I wish I had been, and I missed some of your talks. But okay, now we will come closer to the body with my intervention. Memory. I took memory or remembering or memorance as one of the key figures to start my thinking. Memory is a form of connectivity between persons, and memory is the management of remembering, maybe also by demembering. It is in most cultures bound to materiality in the widest sense. So we know all know souvenirs as tokens of which remind us of times we spent with somebody or times we spent somewhere in one place. And we also know monuments made from stones or also from metal to voluntarily make us remember certain victorious events in the history of a people or a state. So in my intervention, I wanted to play between remembering and demembering as a means of culture making, and it is discussed and pinpointed via a set of paradoxical images, as I will explain. This will be much more ethnographic. It does not work. It cannot be opened, unfortunately. This intervention will be from a much more smaller, more confined ethnographical context. It shows two objects from lowland South America, from the Society of the Yanomami in Venezuela, who settle in the tropical rainforest in the drainage area of the upper Orinoco River. It is a little gourd. Here, a little gourd, and a little bamboo splinter, which is an arrow tip, which is added to an arrow shaft. Okay, the Yanomami live as hunters and foragers and as horticulturalists, and had kept away from intensive contact with non-indigenous and with the capitalist world until not long time ago. And in remote areas, they still live in most aspects the life of a tropical forest-bound society. So they stick to old customs until today. For example, hunting, many still hunt with bow and arrow, and one of these customs being the traditional funeral ritual, a series of endocannibal ceremonies which comprise a set of rules and beliefs. Central to this intervention is the Yanomami taboo of remembering the dead. Try to forget the dead, like the idea of mourning, of weeping, of mourning, of lament, is to make forget. It is literally the translation of Puhi Ohotamo is the work on the mind of the memory, to work the memory off, to work it, to dissolve it by weeping. This the taboo of remembering is expressed in form of the imperative to destroy all the objects which belonged to a person, to the person who died, and the probability of being reminded of the defunct person is strongly to be avoided. They try to take everything away to not be reminded of the person who died. Besides the destruction of the body itself and of the possessions, also there changes in language, in the vocabulary take place, like they would not in a community and around this community, they would even try to avoid a word like basket, like the word for basket when the person dies who had basket in the name. So mainly there are different words for the same objects or phenomena to be able to replace for some years this vocabulary. And often you learn, like me revisiting only after some years, I learned that somebody died when I say, the so-and-so flower, and they're like, shh, we don't call it this anymore. So I say, I know that the person who had this flower or this plant in her name, for example, I remember one case, had died. Okay, but also they tell sturies or also history altered to avoid the mentioning of a dead person. So to study history, you really need to know whom to talk to and how you ask the questions, because if you ask a close relative to to a person who had not long ago died, you will hear the story of an event in a totally altered way, so that this person had not, as if this person had not been in it. So, okay. But this imperative to delete the memory of the dead, first of all, implies to the body itself. So in the funeral, the corpse itself is necessarily destructed. It is burned soon after death, very few hours after death, and then the bones are taken from the ashes of the pyre and selected in a basket. The bone, then a feast is prepared, and many guests are invited from other groups. Given that the defunct person is a grown-up with children, it is done in little family sessions when children die. Okay, but then in the communal session, the bones are ground to a powder-like consistent in a hollow tree, sort of a canoe. After this takes about 1.5 hours or 2 hours, and then this powder-like consistent, which is the result of the grinding of the bones, and this powder is called yupu, and this is the word for ashes. And then communally, the most close relatives and friends and allies will gather to mix the ashes, this is yupu, in a bowl of banana soup, and then drink this. In the photograph, you can see that there is the little this is this little gourd, and the ashes is poured into an aluminum pot in this case, and mixed here. Yeah. Okay, and about half of the portion of the ashes are kept in the little gourds, and sometimes distributed to different family parts when they don't live together, and kept for some months or even 2 or 3 years. And they are preserved in these calabasas and consumed in a number of future funeral ceremonies, where they always come together. It's always at one ceremony. They remember only one dead. Confined within these ceremonies, the defunct person is remembered only when they sit together, weeping, crying, singing laments. And in these laments, the person is not addressed by its name. Names are anyway quite taboo. They don't even call living people by their names, but in this case they would never pronounce their name, but by the respective kinship relation. And also in here, the kinship relation is expressed, but it has a suffix which is not the correct one, to also here alter it and not point to this relation directly. Okay, and during these ceremonies, all the possessions of the defunct persons are piece by piece burned. So until about 100 years ago, they would not possess anything that could not be burned. There were the only things were some stones to work. That was the only things that could not be burned. They have a special a special meaning because they were brought from other places. Okay. Okay. The person is so after the outside of these ceremonial conventions is intentionally forgotten, but of course the social relations remain. Kinship remains and memory remains, but they have to work it off. Okay, this object now in the installation, the other object in this installation, not the gourd, but is the arrow point, and it is a two-pointed bamboo splinter. It bears an equivocal meaning of war, the Yanomami have become famous in the literature as warriors. You remember all the Fierce People book of Napoleon Chagnon, and there were a lot of discussions about this reputation, and I would not like to go here into this discussion here, but we could maybe talk about this also later. But anyway, they are hunters, and they are also warriors, so the Rahaka arrow point, it is one kind, the most prominent kind of several, of about 3 kinds of arrow points which are used. It is non-poisonous. They also have a poisonous one. But this arrow point, the Rahaka arrow point, has a special meaning because it is often given away in situations of visiting each other. So when a visitor comes, he shows the content of his quiver, and so he shows the panorama of his social network. So he says, "Oh, this quiver, they fold it up like cards, and they say, okay, this Rahaka I got from here and from them and these people, and this is from river up, and this is from river down, and this one is from the Shamatari, and this one is from the Maiteri." So by showing these arrow points, they show their social network, and as they are made from different kinds of bamboo, and it is it's distinguishable. The different kinds of bamboos are distinguishable, and the people know quite well which kind of bamboo comes from which area, so they can even see when they are cheated at. When it's like when they don't want to say that they are allies or friends with a group which is enemy to the group they're just visiting, so they would maybe just not tell the truth and say, well, this is from so and so, and there can be uneasy moments in this when they say, well, do you really think that this is from this and this village? Then they have to invent something very quickly. But in general, it is a means of it's a peaceful moment when they show each other the arrow points, and they also exchange the arrow points, and they exchange the arrow point with a word. Here, take this arrow point from me, and don't shoot me with it. So, in general, you have to say that a hunter cannot. A hunter and also a warrior cannot use an arrow point which he himself fabricated. You cannot hit a target with an arrow point which you made yourself. This is very common among hunters and gatherers, that the hunters never use the own arrow point, and also the game they shot, they would not eat from it because it was inserted by the arrow point that was penetrated by his shoot. So there is a relationship between the victim and the shooter, which is very ambivalent. So they would not eat it because that could be very, very dangerous to the person. To the hunter himself. Okay. And then it is also there is also a strong metaphorical meaning attached to the Rahaka. More than one time I heard men saying in public speeches, elders saying in public speeches, "I miss a Rahaka in my quiver," and that was. I remember, which I should not. I remember the young man who died, and I'm still thinking of him. Okay, in this intervention, the arrow point corresponds to or interacts with this small calabash gourd, the container for the cinder of the dead. as it is kept for the rituals to come. And this small vessel, in its form quite similar to a uterus, this small gourd, is kept by the related women, the daughters, the widows, or the mothers of the dead. It is a container of the material substance which still remains until it is consumed and thus becomes part of the other, because the ashes is consumed in the soup, and then it is sort of spread in the corpse of those who consume it. The arrow point here, I tried to hang it the way that it works like that. It turns away and to and away from the vessel, the gourd. They are connected and disconnected at the same time, just as the person is remembered and disremembered simultaneously. As I just explained, the effect of disremembering is hard to fulfill. It is like a task you should fulfill, but it is not so easy. The materiality of a person is a dilemma after his or her death, and at some time remembering is the unique feature of the human and social life, as it is a connection of social relation. With death, it becomes complicated, and the objects here are pointing at this dilemma. And this is why I try to hang them in this fragile way. Okay, I am already about to finish, and I just want to point to one form of connectivity that I could observe in the last few years, or I heard about them. It is that these objects come from a quite remote area. It is like where you can only reach by foot, by boat and then by foot, but on the river, down the Orinoco River, there are several, since the early 1960s, there are Catholic missionaries, Salesian missionaries, and there's the Don Bosco Hermanas, the Don Bosco religious women who do work that they give a lot of medical care, and also care for the schools which are near the rivers. Especially the hermanas, or some of these women have been had been living there for many years. It was about 3 years ago that one very important hermana, a very well acknowledged woman, she died. She was about my age. She died of cancer quite fast. She died in the city, and she was incinerated. And when she was about to be buried in the next provincial city in southern Venezuela, which is about 1,000 kilometers by a river from where we are talking about, there were Yanomami in the city, and they were very strongly urging the other missionaries and the brother of this woman to give them the ashes, because they said she was one of us, she belonged to us, and we have to bury her in our way. And they were really not prepared for this, but as this Antonietta had an indigenous background herself, her brother said, okay, it's up to them. If they want it, it's up to them. So there was, about 3 years ago, the first Christian Yanomami ritual with the consumption of ashes in this ritual. And an Austrian nun just died in last October, and she had lived there among the Yanomami more than 40 years, more than 45 years, and she had told me by email about the funeral of Sor Antonietta, and she had made her will immediately. I'm very old, and if the Yanomami would accept to consume me, I would also be willing to do that. And last November I got the notice that this happened. So there's a connectivity also between these non-indigenous people on the river, and there is a sort of like we talk a lot about the influence of missionaries on the traditional people, but here it is a turnaround, which I think shows that this conduct of the materiality of the body goes beyond beyond the symbolic here, and there was really it was taken by the also by the missionaries by now. Okay, so
what a story. We have a few short minutes for comments and responses and questions before we go to coffee.
Yeah, and air, and then we need air and coffee.
We can also take them to coffee, but if there is a direct response, please. Yes.
I have a very small question and a very big question, so I leave the small question as a question and the big one as a comment.
Yeah.
That's good. The big one is, so earlier Natalie said the text is sort of necessary for those other meanings to exist. And we had a little chat last night, and Phil earlier said something about how the argument or the kind of the anthropological ends are really important in relation to presenting the perspective or the Tibetan way of seeing it. So I'm wondering how you feel about whether the installation or the intervention itself, that in combination with that lovely and fascinating story or that longer explanation of the materials and the substances and relations, how you feel about the relation between the two, if you as an anthropologist really needed to have that performed text to explain it all, or whether you would find it be something interesting about not doing any of that or doing it in a different way. And of course that relation is of interest to me, and I would be interested to know how you feel about the two positions, maybe to reflect on later, if you like. And the tiny question is just very much struck by the smell of resin last night, and I like that very much, and we haven't talked about smell much, but I don't know if there's anything of interest about the resin.
Yeah, okay, if I got you right, well, I can say this is my installation. I did that. This is, I had not seen anything like that, but it came to my mind this very vague equilibrium of remembering and trying not to remember, and this was the picture that came to my mind. But I don't think that this would nobody would understand. I think I could not, like with your dolls. I mean, nobody could think of that these were orishas, and so nobody could think that there is the ashes of dead in these, which is not in here, or not even that this is an arrow tip. But still, it's maybe a little bit dark, but still, I think that maybe, I don't know. You should tell me if what you thought, who did not know about it, what you had, what kind of ideas you had that this could possibly mean. And the reason that because you mentioned it, I tried to fix this with resin really from there, and it's also not very stable. It breaks off, and I have to redo it, and this is part of it. Yeah.
Oh, I would just try to comment on your big question.
Yeah.
Well, I was trying to make up my mind, or to understand what is the format of an academic artistic intervention, and so what would be an artistic intervention. Maybe this for me was the difference. If I was supposed to make an art out of my argument, I would have acted differently. Okay. But then, just to make an academic artistic intervention, I understood, like, visualize your argument.
Sure, exactly.
And then I think the talk is accompanied with what you're doing. But just to make a complete translation, you know, then I would have tried to make an installation without any kind of text that accompanies it. So this is, for me at least, I don't know for you, but for me was trying to follow up the idea of academic artistic intervention.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
I also feel like working on this edge, right? On this edge, like for example, the image is not clear. I had the idea to cover it with a veil, to not make it so clear. So now, when you look at it, it is deliberately, the pixels are big, just to make it a bit blurry. So it is not a clear. It's just to prevent this. Yeah. And we wouldn't get this kind of information in this way from these people, of course. But it is also the outcome of the different MatCons. I mean, the arrow point, it hung in the second MatCon, in the first MatCon, it was not there. But there were other objects, for example, the stone was moving on the table.
We have to leave it on here. It's high time for air
Okay.
and coffee.
Yeah.
Another round of applause for Gabriele. Floor is Mark's.
Okay, firstly I'd like to thank Martin, Philip, Marlene for this wonderful conference and the workshops before as well, the first one that I took part of. I made the mistake last night after a lot of food and a bit too much beer to go back over what I was going to talk about, so I made a complete mess of my notes, so you have to bear with me as I sort of navigate them. So I'm it's more of a kind of thinking aloud exercise rather than the really beautifully crafted talks that came with the interventions yesterday. So it's a thinking aloud, thinking alongside, breathing in the intervention, breathing in with you, thinking with you. So firstly, to describe the intervention, this is a humidifier with two different waters. The water yesterday was collected from the back of lorries that go along King Street. So I live on King Street, it's one of the main arteries in Aberdeen. Lorries, buses, cars pass it every day, mainly bringing oil and water from the north down through Aberdeen, and then all the lorries going back up with equipment, all the rest. Sorry, this is my notes. Here we go. Yes. So it's a street. It's one of the major. I'm going to start again. Sorry. One of the major arteries running through Aberdeen, connecting the fishing ports and the oil industries to the north, to the harbour, and to the cities in the south. Yesterday, the water inside was collected from the back of a lorry carrying fish. They had been landed at Fraserburgh, one of the main fishing ports of the northeast Scotland. Just up the road from my home, the traffic comes to a stop at a red light. And it's on a slight hill, which allows the meltwater of the ice keeping the fish fresh to pour out the back of the lorry. I only realised this a few summers ago when I was cycling behind one of these lorries and I got completely covered in this water, and I realised that this was the smell that I'd noticed in this place, that I'd barely conscious of, that really marked out this place in a kind of conscious, unconscious way. So that was yesterday. Today is from a puddle that formed outside my house after really heavy rains, and there hadn't been any rain for about 2 weeks, which is pretty rare in an Aberdeen winter. So yeah, a rain collecting everything from the road. So I'm back on here. So after the first MatCon workshop last year, the idea of vessel and substance, container and payload really stayed with me, as well as the ideas of the commodity and the gift, the package and the unpackaged. And it kind of came into my work, into my research that I was writing up at the time in Aberdeen. But it also stayed with me we set up a home on the side of King Street, and getting used to dwelling next to this really, really busy road. And it made me really, really aware of everything that was passing through. And that's what, in thinking about an intervention for MatCon, I was really interested in getting a sense of this road, and especially from the still perspective of living next to this really mobile artery. So I started collecting lots of debris, lots of stuff that was falling off the whole time from this road, collecting objects that might tell a story of what is being moved, all the materials and connections that are happening on the road. And then I started taking film from the perspective, from the windows of my house looking out. And then I became more interested actually in the sound that I was collecting than the images that I was collecting. And that sense of the kind of constant rising and falling tides of noise, of vibrations, of living next to this road. It was almost like living next to the sea. But I got tangled up in the editing process and in how to show this, and then one night I remembered a work from the Mexican artist Teresa Margolis that I saw years back on a work trip to Florence. It was on a work trip. I'd been in meetings all day, and on the way back to the hotel I saw an exhibition. I popped in, didn't know anything about it, and I walked into this room through those kind of heavy plastic curtains that you get in butcher shops or in slaughterhouses, into this bare white room. Couldn't see, there was nothing obvious to see, and then I saw in the corner there was a little box, looked like a little radiator, so I went over there was nothing else. And next to it was just a little sign saying the water in this humidifier is the water used to wash down the bodies of murder victims in the morgue in Mexico City. And suddenly the whole room changed. The kind of vague, dank smell, earthy smell that was in the room, that wasn't out of place. It was in a sort of subterranean room, in a basement room next to the river. But suddenly that vague smell just suddenly flipped. It was one of the most powerful works of art that I've ever encountered. Back to my it was a visual shock that kind of left me disgusted, part fascinated. It was a kind of involuntary intimacy, which broke with all the conventions of representational art, of still lives, its nudes, its landscapes, that keeps the world at a kind of polite distance, and it's a kind of relationship of mastery in a certain extent with the art visitor. But it also broke that detached distance of the pathologist examining the body, also the kind of numbing litany of a war without end that's taking place in Mexico, well, all around Mexico. And I was speaking with Natalie yesterday about Duchamp and that relationship to and there's so much in Theresa's work that draws on that tradition handed down from Duchamp, that move away from retinal art, that of the visual being the sole arbiter of form, of beauty, of meaning and of value. But there was something in this work, and I think it's also in Duchamp's work, that it's not simply a move from the sensible to the conceptual, but one that goes from the sensible to the conceptual and back to the sensible again. It introduces a kind of moment of sort of, I don't know, radical uncertainty in that really usual movement from sensory knowledge to knowledge itself. It kind of creates, and from that uncertainty is where the aboutness of the piece sort of unfolds. The way that it presents death, the way it presents murder, the way it presents, a war that goes way beyond Mexico City or Mexico. So, where am I now? Yeah, so it was this disruptive, involuntary sense of intimacy that I borrowed for this intervention, that I'm really interested in. In contrast to Margolis's water from the morgue, the water that's in here is kind of it has a weak materiality in the terms that we were talking about yesterday, in terms that Philip was talking about, in terms of how materials are co-opted into human practices, into human ways of meaning making, into human worlds. It's nearly impossible to weave it into a coherent story around the social. There's nothing really symbolic about it. There's really little ethnographic context to give it meaning, to kind of fill it out. This water is kind of unattended, abject remainder of business as usual. I really like the quote, where's Lorenzo? Yeah, from Kathleen Stewart, that space at the side of the road that you talked about. And it's kind of, it's sort of destitute in its literality. This is the puddle water. Presenting in the flesh, as it were, another inadvertent, unaccounted mode of connectivity and materiality that nevertheless is intrinsic to human ways of becoming and human sociality. I'll go through. So where am I on this one? So recently I read Tim's article on the weather world, and there he talks about the engineering of the road, of the urban surface, levelling the ground and covering it with a layer of hard, resistant material like asphalt. And here I quote from Tim, that converts the ground into a kind of surface that theorists of modernity always thought that it was, level, homogeneous, pre-existent and inert. It is to make the earth into a stage, a platform, a baseboard, or in a word, an infrastructure upon which the superstructure of the city can be erected. And this superstructure is a kind of dream of frictionless and instant connectivity of kind of global supply chains and all the rest that so much of the movement along this road takes part in, this kind of dream of connectivity. But this hard surface world still partakes in the weather, in the medium in which we live. A colleague and friend at Aberdeen, Jermaine Meulemans, together with a collective that he's part of artists and social scientists, they made a really fascinating installation, artwork on petrichor, which is the smell of soil after the rain. And his point is that petrichor is not an it's not a thing, it's not a material. Rather, it can only emerge in between, in the complex system of interactions between rain, water, soil, the microorganisms in the earth. And it's not only the smell that is in these interactions, but the soil itself. It's not a singular substance, the soil, but rather he calls it a moving milieu that takes place between the geological, the biological, and the atmospheric, and he's really interested in urban soils, and it makes that distinction between human practices and geological practices, natural practices. It doesn't make any sense. It kind of wipes out that any clear dichotomy between the two. And likewise, this water in here, the air that we're breathing, can be thought of as a moving milieu, a coming together of the heavy hydrocarbons of the asphalt, the synthetic rubber and the steel of the tyres, the salt that the council put down on the roads all over the winter, tobacco, spit, dog shit, the cold humid air blowing in from the sea, and the exhausts of countless cars that come over. So a lot of with its carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, ozone, CFCs, volatile organic compounds, particulate matter, metals, heavy metals. A lot of these were familiar from Gillian's talk on smoke, but a lot of them are new. These are really different materials in some sense. And what it presents us with, this water, this air, is a different connectivity than that defined by the inert networks of infrastructure, nor the materiality of the mid-sized dry goods, as Latour talks about it, that dominate our consumer economies, as well as the artifacts from other economies, other ways of life that anthropologists are interested in, or a lot of anthropologists are interested in. So this water marks a kind of involuntary connectivity of a commons, or Tim was talking about an undercommons the other day. in which our visible and valued world necessarily partakes. So this brings to mind quickly two things that I've been reading recently. Firstly, The Invention of Culture by Roy Wagner, which is the first time I've read it, I'm ashamed to say, but it's, very interesting. And I'm really, in it, he makes the point that Western notions of culture are intrinsically tied to the notion of cultivation, to the notion of production. And he makes the distinction between the opera house version of culture, so the kind of high culture in its cultivation of the civilized individual, but how that partakes in a much wider sense of culture as the sum of the technologies and the inventions that allow us to transform the earth through our labour. And he juxtaposes that with the Melanesian societies that he's interested in, where it's kind of reversed. It's not around technologies, they're backgrounded. What it's about is the production of people and production of the social. But in both, production is key. And what interests me in this air that we're breathing is that it kind of reverses that ratio between the doing, that production of the social, and its undergoing of the social, and how all the production of the socials always takes place within a much wider ecology of connections. Second one is Peter Sloterdijk's work on spheres, and there it kind of, in his sort of grand way, he presents a story of modernity which isn't one of the kind of gradual domination of nature through the mastery of its forces, but rather it's almost its reverse. It's the kind of gradual explication of the ways that we're constitutionally dependent on the earth and its ecologies. It kind of completely flips the ratio of doing and undergoing. So the intimacy of this air, or this malaria, this bad air in many ways, that's coming out of the humidifier, also disrupts the sense of materiality, or materials for that matter, that are founded on the phenomenological subject. So much of what is here, of what we're breathing, escapes us. So even though it's just the puddle water, we don't really know what that puddle water is, what it's composed of, or rather what the things that compose the puddle water, what they can do. So this goes back to yesterday morning's talk, Tom's talk and Philip's talk, on a kind of chemical sensibility. So, actually, I'm going to go back a little bit. So what escapes us is, Tim was also talking about those interstitial differences, and these are interstitial differences that are playing out in the alveoli of our lungs and the crevices of our brain. But that doesn't place them on the sides of substances as opposed to materiality, to the primary qualities of the world as opposed to the secondary qualities of human perception and human world making. And so this is going to Tom's paper yesterday. I'm interested in a kind of chemical sensibility, or a metabolic sensibility of materials and their connectivity. What interests me in chemistry as opposed to physics is that it's first and foremost an empirical science, not a theoretical one, interested in the ontological sense of what a substance is, but rather it's this kind of careful experimental elaboration of what a substance can do through a kind of tradition of practices and equipment, which, as Bruno Latour talks about, it kind of extends the reach of the sensible. It extends the multitudes of entities in which the body can form relations with, or rather sensible relationships with, because these are relations that are taking place nevertheless. And it's kind of partly, it reminds me of this morning and yesterday morning in Anna Maria's kitchen, where I was boiling up the water from the fish lorries, but also from the puddle, to kind of kill the bacteria, because I didn't want you all coming down with pneumonia. But just the difficulty of working with these materials, that you just don't know what they are. You don't know their actancy or their efficacy, as Philip was talking. So in a way, there's a really partial story of what this water is that's being explicated at the sort of margins of chemistry, of biochemistry, of medical science, at the margins of a research agenda that's generally focused on much more important, valuable things, at least within the discourse of our society, and also at the margins of governmentality, of the margins of environmental agencies that are trying to monitor these things, trying to get a sense of what is in the air, what is in these streets. And these provide a kind of counter discourse of pollution that kind of act against business as usual in a way. They act as a kind of counter discourse to if you can think of the road as a curated environment in terms of infrastructure and the supply chains that it enables. But this water, this air, this weather of King Street is more than just a pollutant, it's also the medium in which we are immersed. And this is going back to Tim's paper on weather, through which, in our immersion, we are constituted as temperate beings. This is a photo of my son taken from outside on King Street with one of the lines of the endless lines of cars and lorries that he makes and remakes every day. He loves cars, he loves making traffic jams that kind of in constant strange resonance with the world outside, and he also loves the sirens, loves and so there's this is the medium in which he is growing, he is the world taking form for him and taking form for me. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Now we have time for 2 short responses. Lisa.
I think it's rather a comment that I'm trying to link that back to the discussion we just had with the first 2 papers, because it makes so much sense. I think we talked about the void, the slate, the paved streets, all this sleekness kind of, and that there's always an interplay with the undergoings, with the stuff that pierces it, and that I find it really interesting to think about the potentialities of both figures of thought, that we could say that's all layered, all this relational, that's the relations first, and then we make it clean, and that we also saw the potentiality kind of what we can get out of making things clean, that this is very powerful movement, and this is going on, and this is structuring so much of our life world. And then I find it interesting that we take this step out of discussing it's either entities first or relations first. Maybe we can still discuss that, but that we look at interplay and how they form the world we are in.
Yeah. Yeah.
I found it remarkable how you started. You entered that, butcher, opening that, entering the space, and yet you needed to label in order for that setting to become an environment.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and it's precisely what the whole literature to me on affect, on non-representation, misses. Your correspondence really needed the history and that narrative hook, at least to unfold in that particular way. So
yeah.
My question would be then to methodologically, how do we understand your correspondence with that environment?
Within that space of the...
Well, it seems to me that it once again, it required narrative, at least a narrative hook for both the artist and that background to appear. I mean, it's not that the environment would have made an impact upon you anyway. If it smells,
exactly.
That's not my point.
But to become tangible.
Well, not just tangible, but for it to become that particular environment. Again, I had that briefly talk with Martin this morning about it. Once I went to the Emotional Geographies conference, and everyone is into non-representation, into affect, and all against language, all against narrative. And I said, guys, you can't understand the affordance of a concentration camp, for example, without the narrative of the Holocaust. It doesn't make any sense. If you would enter as a school class without being pre-framed, you would have a completely different correspondence with the material, the door, and whatsoever. So once again, I in my own research, and I love material, I love it all, but I can't get past narrative, whatever I do.
Yeah, but for me, the really interesting piece with Theresa's work is exactly the narrative takes place in the kind of constant flipping between the story that's told and the thing the thing it's being told about. We were talking, Natalie, yesterday about the difference of telling a story next to the work itself, and how that's really different than presenting a talk.
Yeah.
And there's something in that space in between that kind of keeps, that it doesn't allow it to be reduced to one or the other, cool. Which I think, and that's in this, yeah.
Thank you.
On that note, coffee.
I was, in general, over the last 2 days, wondering in the discussions where actually, because we talk a lot about materiality and concepts, and how concepts materialize, but not so much so far. We haven't really focused on how concepts are changed by the materiality of the things that the concepts invoke, that invoke the concepts. For example, stones in Tibet, or wooden poles. Maybe it does feedback on the concepts, and or Barbie dolls and a different toy. I mean, even if they symbolize something else, maybe there might be more going on there. And this is also what I'm going to talk about, actually. So there is you can just write the wave. I guess most of you have noticed this colorful curtain over the last 2 days, but due to the tight schedule, have not really had time to engage with the installation. As I initially planned, because I thought it would be a more interactive exploration. But this also has some interesting implications that I'll come back to later on. So let me first give you some context and summarize the main question that I'm trying to tackle here. My intervention seeks to tease out the relationship between the materiality of life and non-material connections made through mobile phones. In both spheres, knowledge is created through experience. In the first, rather through the body, and in the other one, through the mind. Also, there might not be such a big difference after all. I'll circle around this supposed dichotomy of material and immaterial throughout my presentation. Through this curtain of veils and a video of a wedding ceremony inside, I invite the audience, you, to attain a sense of gender segregation and conjugal relationships in the high mountain area of northern Pakistan, as well as to probe a more ambiguous yet effective mobile space, which is an essential window. We'll come to that. And I think most people have not noticed so far, or maybe not really looked at it too much, even when they entered the room. In my fieldwork on mobile phones and gender relations in the high mountain area, I was increasingly confronted with some conceptual questions that I want to discuss here. In telecommunication networks, our mind travels over geographical and social boundaries. How can we conceptualize space and place in that framework? Do material practices still play a role in virtual connections? And do mobile phones redefine interpersonal relationships? And how are these mobile links negotiated in the local cultural frameworks? I will start with a quote from a young woman in Gilgit describing her associations with mobile phone use, what comes to her mind when she actually texts. She says, "When I write messages and, for example, have to laugh, the other's face comes to my mind. If the other person says I'm here or there in a shop or eating apricots or whatsoever, I can picture them without seeing. That she would be laughing like that they might be sitting in the shop like that, and so on." So she imagines the people she is talking to on the basis of shared experience. In on-site meetings, the girl learned to estimate her interlocutor's reaction, and even if she has never seen the location where the other one is at the moment, she can draw from a cultural repository to fill in missing details, such as imagine the busy life in a hardware shop, where she could actually never go. Although she does not encounter the other person, she nevertheless meets them in this mobile space or on the phone. Additionally, we can fathom that the content of these messages has an impact on the emotional state of all the people involved. For example, a joking SMS might cheer up a friend and transmit a sense of connection and intimacy, as well as make the sender happy as she pictures the other one laughing at her message. In these few lines, thus, the girl from Gilgit actually aptly captures a collapse of ontological dualisms such as mind and body and space and place. Also, the virtual characteristic of mobile phone connections might lead to the fast conclusion to speak of a mobile space. I want to distance myself from the widespread conception of space as merely consisting of social structures and imaginations. Based on Lefebvre's work about space as socio-historical product, the concept has turned into a somewhat abstract idea that has been spurred by an emphasis on research on globalization in the 1990s. Many social scientists advertised space to target older perception of place as flat, immobilized surface, a stasis that has falsely been created by the West in the project of modernity and territorial imperialism by borders and maps, as we have already talked about borders and maps a lot. They postulate a socially constructed space against place as a specific manifestation of the space in a geographic location in time. In reaction to these abstract formulations of space, a more materialist perception developed among anthropologists in the last 2 decades, as this symposium is vividly demonstrating. That's why my installation starts on a phenomenological level. So this obstructive wall, made of Pakistani headscarves, symbolized the cultural practice of parda, literally meaning curtain, which stands for veiling and gender segregation. Women cover themselves for various reasons, such as religious observance or fashion, and most importantly, to express a highly embodied form of modesty. Embodiment, in the way I define the term, is not a singular process of incorporating pre-established cultural structures, but an ongoing process of unconsciously and consciously enacting one's social group's habitus, in plural. Also a form of tacit knowledge. By sensing our own performances and movements, we penetrate these norms, the norms that we actually just expressed, and so they influence our the negotiation of these norms. As Judith Butler argues, quote, "The task is to think of being acted on and acting simultaneously, and not as a sequence." The subject so emerges from an ongoing process of negotiation of organic and immaterial things, environments, discourses, and norms. What Lisa also commented on earlier, this very interactive process of emergence. Parda as a social practice, as well as an expression of embodied morals and values, serves to regulate male and female relations, inflicting them with distance and reserve. For women, it is therefore extremely important to assess where one literally stands and how to behave in certain places. Laughing out loud among friends at home, for example, doesn't threaten her reputation as open smiles in a bazaar area would. Most of you that I watched or talked to during the last 2 days either didn't really notice that there's something behind this wall, or they entered and or first they didn't really dare to enter, or kind of peeked in. So really this curtain invokes restraint. I mean, the materiality of this curtain obviously invokes restraint and functions or serves its function as of seclusion very well. But once in, the general reaction that I observed was one of comfort and coziness, and everyone appreciated it as a private space that it offers, that it provides. So let me open it. So most of you cannot see the video now, but you can watch it later on, I suppose. Leaving behind the public area, only male family members usually enter the private compound. Here, gender segregation is relaxed, and many elements of distance and reserve, but still many elements of distance and reserve continue to characterize male-female relationships, especially the ones between husband and wife, as they would never show their mutual affection in front of others. They are not hiding their kind of real selves or staging their behavior, but As they would say themselves, they naturally feel embarrassed when others observe their intimacy, which would be proof for uncontrolled emotionality and is directly associated with the inversion of parda, with sexuality. Of course, sensing our life world is not pre-social. Places, social structures, and cultural practices influence our perception and synthesize each other. Current anthropological trends manage to integrate spatial constructivism into conceptions of place without losing it to abstraction. Although I greatly appreciate the stress on materiality, it rather enforces than consolidates the dichotomy between space and place. By defending either one of the two, instead of finding parallels, differences are further accentuated. However, what I suggest, mobile space could reconcile those both concepts. Especially, it depends on the framework, but for mobile phones it works out very well. Many of my interlocutors in Gilgit emphasize that mobile phones do not only connect two places with each other, that users do not virtually travel only to the place where the other person is, but they meet in an invisible site in between that is uncoupled from place-based characteristics of sensory perception. Here a quote from Gilgit. It feels like a third space, a mobile world. In this space, only voices meet and faces appear in the mind. So to grasp this new virtual world, a reconceptualization of place is needed. I suggest a return to space that transcends our binary understanding of space and place by including recent considerations of place's material qualities, mobile space as an extension of place. Just like space, it is a social construction, meaning that mobile space is constituted by collectively produced norms and values, is fleeting rather than pre-given. And just like place, although interpersonal communication is uncoupled from physical movement, it is not detached from bodily experience per se. Encounters in mobile space affect us, even without the immediate materiality we sense and experience something. The couple in this video, for example, I hope that this side has already watched the video, has been in touch on mobile phones for about a year before their wedding ceremony. And this is a part of the wedding, of the 3-day wedding. After the arrangement of their marriage, they fell in love, exchanging messages on a mobile phone, and established a relationship of intimacy for over hours-long conversations and occasional visits, or the man's occasional visits to the girl's family. Although they feel self-conscious and intimidated in front of others, they are already familiar with each other from the meetings in mobile space, thus not so shy when they are alone as they appear in the video. For example, the bride is already pregnant, which she's, of course, not supposed to be. So intimacy over mobile phone works out quite well. Since experiences in place shape our epistemologies, they also play a key role for people to assess this new mobile space. When appropriating mobile telephony, Gilgiti women navigate along this intrinsic sense of charm or modesty. For example, they usually do not answer calls by unknown numbers, as they would also not chit-chat with a stranger in public. However, and now I'm coming to the point that I wanted to make, the embodiment model is not static and leaves room for creative variation. Since our bodies and minds are entangled with endless social, cultural, and material factors, they influence and mutually constitute each other. They constantly emerge into something new or altered. Modulation is the term that I personally find describes this process best. In the same line of thought, new influences from mobile space are factors that have to be dealt with in place also. What Sarah Pink describes as emplacement, that the experience of place is crucial in the process of knowledge production, also has to be acknowledged for space. Knowledge is produced through our movement, our virtual movement in space. Although in this space mobility is virtual instead of physical, it nevertheless affects our perception and has an emotional impact. In mobile space, places and real-life relationships are found uncoupled from the original contexts. Thus, the new ambiguous space poses an opportunity and serves as a platform to renegotiate existing norms and values. In the space in between mobile phone users, they modify social relationships, embody these practices, and reconceptualize cultural concepts through that. Floating in space here on the window, the central one, it's really hard to see. I think you have to move there closer and have a closer look at it. But floating in space is what symbolizes this mobile space. For example, there's a quite explicit and sexually charged SMS chat between newlyweds. Intimate thoughts that they would actually never verbalize in face-to-face communication materializes in these messages and creates a momentum. So it leaves a mark on the existing concepts. And finally, there's also a QR code on the right side that unfortunately not many of you have used so far. But it's a connection to one of my friends in Gilgit, and you could, through this way, you could actually tease out this mobile space. What happens when you don't know the other person, or what do you imagine? But unfortunately, there are technological barriers also, as I had to notice. For example, some people don't possess a mobile phone, some don't have WhatsApp, some don't have a QR code reader, and so on. So just like any other infrastructure, mobile phone connectivity follows certain pathways, so it's less mobile than we actually associate, that it actually implies. But to open the floor now for a discussion, I would maybe also invite people who did, I guess I only know of one so far, but who did use the QR code and talk to my research assistant, how your experience was.
I just sent her a picture of you making this presentation.
Okay, interesting.
No, she hasn't replied.
Too bad. Okay, thank you.
We have 15 minutes for questions. I think it would make sense if you feel free to enter it as you wish while engaging with Anna Maria.
Doesn't feel so secluded anymore with the open curtain.
But now.
No, actually I thought that it was organized by you so that we can have somewhere to sleep if we're feeling tired.
I think people have used it to take a short nap. Yeah.
I have a question about the video. So it's a very female space, but there are two cameras in the video, and I think they're like the boys are filming it.
Because they have the technology to do, yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, yeah, they're all relatives, though.
Right. Yeah. No, but would it be sort of unmodest for a girl to film a public event?
No.
No.
I mean, first of all, it's not really public. I'm not sure if she would film a bazaar setting, but usually the boys are the ones who have more money and have the cameras. It's simple as that. Yeah. But they take pictures on the mobile, and it's all about posing. So they do that a lot.